For the first time in 2.5 years, Russia gained nothing. Not a single kilometer. And what happened next may change how this war ends. Because what you're about to see is not just another battlefield update. It is the moment a war begins to shift quietly, decisively, and in ways few outside Kiev fully understand. In the quiet dawn of spring 2026, as the first pale light crept across the battle-scarred fields of eastern Ukraine, a subtle but profound shift began to unfold, one that would quietly challenge everything the world thought it understood about this conflict. For those who have followed the war through its long, grinding chapters, the arrival of another spring has often carried the weight of grim predictability. This time, however, the air itself seemed to carry a different tension. Let that feeling settle with you for a moment, because what was about to be revealed would prove far more consequential than any headline had prepared us for. Most seasoned observers, including many here in the United States, had come to accept a familiar narrative. Russia, drawing on its deep reserves of manpower and its meticulously prepared spring offensive, was expected to finally break the deadlock. Putin's strategy of infiltration and gray zone pressure had already turned large stretches of unoccupied land into claimed territory. Now, with intensified assaults planned across multiple critical axes toward Kostiantynivka, Lyman, the approaches to Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia, and the heavily fortified cities of Donetsk, the Donbass itself, appeared poised to begin its collapse under the sheer weight of numbers. That was what the world thought. That was the script written and accepted by analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. But on the 15th of April, a single, measured Facebook post from Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Syrsky, began to rewrite that entire chapter in calm, deliberate language. He did not speak of desperate defense or exhausted resources. Instead, he spoke of deliberate choice. "We must seize the strategic initiative," Syrsky stated. "Thus we are conducting an active defense." And with those carefully chosen words came the first quiet revelation, one that forced even the most cautious observers to pause. In the month of March alone, Ukrainian forces had regained control over 58 square kilometers of territory previously held by the enemy. Picture, if you will, what this looked like from the Russian side on the ground. Commanders who had committed everything to an all-out spring push wave after wave of troops meant to overwhelm Ukrainian lines suddenly found their carefully orchestrated advances met not with collapse, but with precise, calculated counter-pressure in exactly the places they could least afford to lose ground. The very sectors they had hoped would serve as springboards for further gains were instead becoming points of quiet vulnerability. Let that image linger. The offensive that Moscow had billed as the beginning of its decisive victory march had, by the end of March, delivered something the Kremlin had not anticipated. A net territorial gain of 0, the first such month in 2.5 years. And yet, even this striking pivot was only the surface of a much deeper transformation already underway. Behind Syrsky's measured announcement lay a story of quiet maturation, of a military that had learned to turn quality of operations into a decisive counterweight against sheer quantity. The world had been watching the wrong metric, waiting for Russia to break through, when in reality Ukraine had already begun to dictate the tempo in carefully chosen places. That last line deserves a moment of reflection. What many believed would be Russia's spring of triumph was instead becoming the season in which the balance of this conflict began to shift in ways few had foreseen. Because what looked like a modest territorial gain was actually the first visible crack in Russia's entire war strategy. And as that quiet pivot began to register, the deeper problem facing Russia started to come into sharper focus. For weeks, Moscow had poured resources into what it called its Grand Spring Offensive, intensifying assaults across the entire front. The goal was unambiguous: to collapse Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass and seize vast new stretches of territory. Yet the numbers that emerged by the end of March told a story that contradicted every expectation. Russia's once formidable rate of advance, which had reached 14.2 square kilometers per day during the same period the previous year, had slowed dramatically to just 2.85 square kilometers per day. Let that number sink in for a moment. A reduction by a factor of 5 in a single year, proof that the momentum Russia had counted on was slipping away. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces were moving in the opposite direction. In carefully selected sectors, they were achieving daily gains of 5.2 square kilometers, nearly twice the rate Russia could manage. This was not the result of months of Russian progress being clawed back. On the contrary, these advances came on the heels of an already impressive February, when Ukraine had already retaken approximately 345 square kilometers in the south alone. By the close of March, that cumulative figure had climbed to 550 square kilometers. Picture the shift from the Russian command perspective. The very offensive designed to deliver decisive breakthroughs was instead producing the first month in 2.5 years in which Russia's net territorial gain stood at zero. Because what looked like a stalled offensive was actually the visible symptom of a much larger strategic failure beginning to unfold. That human cost arrived in the form of staggering casualties. In March alone, Ukraine's forces inflicted 39,800 Russian soldiers, killed or wounded, a 33% increase over the already heavy losses of February. Let that number settle with you. 39,800 in a single month. And here the first phased mechanism of Ukraine's strategy began to emerge into view. 94% of those casualties were caused by Ukrainian drones, both flying and ground-based. This was not scattered attrition. It was a deliberate, precision-driven campaign designed to blunt Russia's offensive power while creating openings elsewhere. Now imagine that battlefield, not from a map, not from a command room, but from the ground itself. A Russian infantry unit moves forward through broken terrain, expecting artillery, expecting gunfire, expecting the kind of threats soldiers have trained for over decades. But what they encounter instead is something far more disorienting: a constant, invisible presence. Drones circling above at altitudes too high to hear, too small to detect with the naked eye, yet close enough to observe every movement. A vehicle engine starts, and within seconds, its thermal signature is identified. A squad pauses behind cover, believing they are concealed, unaware that their position has already been marked. The delay between detection and strike collapses to moments. There is no build-up, no warning, no time to react. This is not warfare, as it was practiced in the 20th century. This is persistent surveillance fused with instant precision, and when applied across an entire front, across thousands of engagements per day, it does more than increase casualties. It changes behavior. It forces hesitation. It slows movement. It erodes confidence. Over time, that psychological pressure becomes just as important as the physical losses, because an army that cannot move freely, cannot conceal itself, and cannot predict where the next strike will come from, is no longer operating with initiative. It is reacting. And in modern warfare, the loss of initiative is often the first step towards systemic decline, because what looked like heavy casualties was actually the opening act of a phased mechanism that Ukraine had been building for months, layer by layer, sector by sector. Yet the full scale of Russia's strategic reversal only became undeniable when the spring offensive itself was put under the microscope. Moscow had ramped up attacks across every major direction: Kostiantynivka, Lyman, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and the fortress belt around Donetsk, throwing wave after wave of soldiers forward in the only playbook it seemed to know. The expectation was clear: more pressure should have produced more territory. Basic logic, after all, suggested that intensified assaults would translate into tangible gains, but the battlefield refused to cooperate with that logic. Russia's rate of advance, which had once averaged 14.2 square kilometers per day during the comparable period the previous year, had collapsed to just 2.85 square kilometers per day. Let that number sink in for a moment: a slowdown by a factor of 5 in 12 months. At the same time, Ukrainian forces were quietly achieving daily gains of 5.2 square kilometers, nearly twice what Russia could manage even on its best days. This was not a matter of reclaiming land after months of Russian progress. It was the direct result of Ukraine's active defense meeting Russia's offensive head-on and reversing the momentum in real time. According to assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, March 2026 marked the first month in 2.5 years in which Russia's territorial gains amounted to a net zero. Picture the quiet consternation that must have rippled through Russian command centers as the month drew to a close. The Grand Spring Offensive, billed as the campaign that would finally shatter Ukrainian resistance in the Donbass, had instead delivered the opposite of what Moscow had promised its own people and its allies. Heavy fighting continued in the Oleksandrivka and Pokrovsk directions, yet the promised breakthroughs never materialized. The fortress cities held. The buffer zones Russia hoped to carve out remained contested or lost. Because what looked like a failed offensive was actually the moment Ukraine began dictating the tempo of the war. That mechanism started, as so many modern battlefield turning points do, in the skies and on the ground with drones. In March, 94% of the 39,800 Russian casualties were attributed directly to Ukrainian drones, both aerial and ground-based systems, operating with lethal precision. Let that figure settle with you. Nearly 37,500 lives altered or lost because of technology that Ukraine had scaled and integrated at a pace Russia could not match. But the drone story ran deeper than the casualty count. For the first time in the entire war, Ukraine outproduced and outlaunched Russia in long-range strikes. Ukrainian forces sent 8,200 long-range drones against Russian targets, while Russia managed only 7,100 in return. At the same time, a new generation of interceptor drones allowed Ukraine to achieve a 92% interception rate against incoming Shaheds, rendering Russia's once dominant aerial pressure far less effective. Picture the reversal from the Russian perspective. The side that had relied on volume of cheap drones to terrorize Ukrainian cities and infrastructure was now on the defensive, in the very domain it had once controlled. Those deep strikes were not random, they were methodical. 85 targets inside Russia alone were hit during the month: oil refining facilities, production plants, ammunition depots, and command nodes. Each strike designed to erode the logistics that fed the front lines, to starve the offensive of fuel, spare parts, and fresh munitions before they could ever reach the troops. This was the visible edge of a strategy that went far beyond simple attrition. It was the first layer of a phased approach that weakened Russia from the inside while Ukrainian ground forces held the line and struck where Russia was thinnest. Because what looked like simple drone warfare was actually the opening layer of a strategy that weakened Russia from the inside while Ukrainian ground forces held the line and struck where Russia was thinnest. And as the first layer of that mechanism, drones and deep strikes, began to erode Russia's capacity from within, the deeper architecture of Ukraine's active defense came into view. General Syrskyi had chosen his words with precision back on April 15. "We must seize the strategic initiative," he said. "Thus we are conducting an active defense." Those words were not rhetoric. They described a deliberate doctrine that countered Russian numbers with Ukrainian quality of combat operations, forcing the enemy to play by Kyiv's rules and constantly postponing Moscow's deadlines for completing its tasks. Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov had signaled the same shift earlier in the year when he set an ambitious target of 55,000 irrecoverable Russian casualties per month. Combined with systemic reform inside the Ukrainian military, he argued, this would allow Ukraine to move from holding the line to taking the initiative, and that is exactly what the battlefield began to reflect. Ukraine was not attempting a sweeping counteroffensive across the entire 1,320-kilometer front. That had been the costly lesson of 2023, when forces were spread too thin. Instead, Kyiv adopted a sector-based approach, concentrating its efforts where Russia had stretched itself thinnest. Picture the quiet calculation behind those choices. In areas like Oleksandrivka and the approaches to Dnipropetrovsk, Ukrainian commanders identified small, isolated Russian groupings that had infiltrated under the earlier gray zone strategy. Rather than contest every inch of strategically unimportant territory, Ukraine allowed Russia to claim certain zones while striking with precision in the sectors that actually mattered, disrupting Russia's plans for buffer zones around Donetsk and pushing back against advances in Zaporizhia. The result was controlled disruption. Russia found itself forced to shuffle troops in directions it had not anticipated, weakening its main thrusts elsewhere. Let that image linger. What looked like Russian gains on paper were, in reality, creating new vulnerabilities that Ukraine was ready to exploit. Because what looked like small, isolated Ukrainian gains was actually a controlled disruption of Russia's entire operational concept. That learning loop is where the true maturation of the Ukrainian military becomes visible. Every month, Ukrainian commanders conduct detailed assessments of combat operations, refining tactics and improving coordination at every level. Research and development are no longer confined to distant laboratories, they are embedded directly into frontline units. New training pipelines have strengthened air defense crews. Underground networks, tunnels constructed in what were once kill zones, have evolved from ambush corridors into logistical arteries capable of moving troops and equipment unseen. Innovation has become part of the fighting force itself. Syrskyi himself has noted that the Ukrainian military never stands still. This constant self-assessment, this willingness to adapt faster than the opponent, is what has allowed quality of operations to serve as a decisive counterweight against sheer quantity. Between June 2025 and March 2026, Ukraine carried out 540 strikes against Russian air defense systems alone. Those strikes were not isolated. They created the safe corridors that enabled the mid-range drone campaign, now targeting ammunition depots, Shahed storage facilities, command centers, and troop concentrations in the occupied territories. Russia's frontline units suddenly found themselves operating without the supplies and support they needed, precisely because the protective shield that once guarded their rear had been systematically dismantled. Picture the cumulative effect from the Russian perspective. Just as commanders believed they had adapted to one Ukrainian tactic, another surprise emerged. Tunnels used for logistics, embedded R&D, delivering new capabilities in real time. Monthly after-action reviews turning yesterday's lessons into tomorrow's advantages. The contrast with Russia's approach could not be starker. While Moscow continued to rely on an attritional playbook that had changed little since 2022, Ukraine had turned the pressure of invasion into a catalyst for constant evolution. Because what looked like tactical adaptation was actually the final learning loop that bound every layer together: drones, sector strategy, deep strikes, real-time intelligence, and systemic reform into a cohesive whole. And so we arrive at the strategic consequences that flow directly from everything we have examined. Russia's recruitment target for the year stood at 455,000 new soldiers. At the current pace of 1,240 recruits per day, Moscow now faces a projected shortfall of 73,000 troops by the end of 2026. Fewer fresh soldiers reaching the front means thinner defensive lines in the very sectors Ukraine has chosen to strike. Every Ukrainian gain in one carefully selected zone forces Russian commanders to pull resources from another. The buffer zones Moscow hoped to establish around Donetsk are now contested or lost. The momentum that once seemed inevitable now belongs unmistakably to the side that chose quality over quantity and foresight over brute force. Picture the quiet recalibration happening inside Russian command rooms as spring 2026 draws to a close. The spring offensive that was meant to deliver the decisive breakthrough has instead become the clearest evidence yet that the old attritional model is cracking under the pressure of a more adaptive opponent. Every month, Ukraine conducts its rigorous after-action reviews, turning yesterday's lessons into tomorrow's advantages. Every drone strike, every sector counterattack, every deep logistical disruption compounds the effect. What began as isolated tactical successes has coalesced into a coherent operational shift that is reshaping the battlefield in real time. Let that cumulative weight settle with you. The numbers we have seen: 58 square kilometers regained in March, 5.2 square kilometers gained per day on average, 39,800 Russian casualties are not isolated data points. They are the measurable proof of a military that has matured under fire into one of the most innovative and effective forces of the 21st century. These battlefield realities carry implications that reach well beyond the front lines. What we are witnessing is the emergence of a nation that began this war in a desperate struggle for survival and has transformed, through relentless adaptation, into a strategic actor capable of dictating tempo against a much larger adversary. Ukraine has embedded research and development into its fighting units. It has built real-time intelligence systems, refined core-level coordination, and turned the very pressure of invasion into a catalyst for constant evolution. Russia, by contrast, continues to rely on a playbook that has changed little since the earliest days of the conflict. The contrast is no longer theoretical. It is measurable in kilometers regained, in casualties inflicted, and in initiatives seized. That last line deserves a moment of reflection. A defense that many once feared would collapse has quietly evolved into an active, intelligent counterpressure that is forcing the larger power to confront the limits of its own strategy. And here we return to where we began, in the quiet dawn of spring 2026, as the first pale light touched those battle-scarred fields of eastern Ukraine. What the world thought would be Russia's season of triumph has instead become the season in which the balance began to shift in ways few outside Kyiv had fully anticipated. The 58 square kilometers reclaimed in March are not merely territory. They are the visible signature of a deeper transformation, one that suggests the spring of 2026 may one day be remembered not as the month Russia nearly broke through, but as the month the tide turned with a quiet, unmistakable finality. The implications of this shift extend far beyond Ukraine itself. Military planners across NATO, and particularly in the United States, are watching these developments closely, not just for what they reveal about Russia, but for what they suggest about the future of warfare more broadly. For decades, Western doctrine has emphasized technological superiority, networked operations, and rapid decision-making. What is now unfolding in Ukraine is a real-world demonstration of those principles under extreme pressure. The integration of drones, real-time intelligence, decentralized command structures, and continuous adaptation is not theoretical, it is operational. At the same time, it is forcing a reassessment of traditional assumptions about force structure, logistics, and survivability. Large formations, once seen as symbols of strength, are increasingly vulnerable to persistent surveillance and precision strikes. Static defenses, once considered reliable, are now exposed to continuous disruption. Even the concept of a rear area is being challenged, as long-range strikes blur the line between front and support zones. For the United States and its allies, the lessons are clear but uncomfortable. Future conflicts will not be defined solely by who has more advanced weapons, but by who can integrate those systems more effectively, adapt more rapidly, and sustain that adaptation over time. In that sense, Ukraine is not just fighting a war, it is shaping the template by which future wars may be understood. Because what we are watching here isn't just a war. It is the blueprint of how modern wars will be fought from now on. If this deeper strategic picture has changed how you see the conflict unfolding in Ukraine today, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe and join a growing community that looks beyond the headlines to understand the real forces shaping our world. The balance is shifting, and we are only beginning to see how profoundly